Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my Total War Warhammer 2 Legendary Lord lore video for Luthor Harkon and his zombie pirates. And this is the first video brought to you and voted for by my patrons. If you're interested in getting involved in the next topic vote for one of my videos for next month, do check out my Patreon page. There'll be a link in the description below. But today we are going to cover Luthor Harkon and his band of zombie pirates and how they came about being. In a previous video where I look at the future and potential DLCs for Total War Warhammer 2, we bring up Luthor Harkon because he might be a fantastic way in which Creative Assembly can reintroduce the vampire counts into Total War Warhammer 2's campaign map. But I cover that a lot in that video. If you'd like to check that out, do check the top right hand corner now, just to have an idea of my thinking of where Luthor Harkon fits in as far as the landscape of Total War Warhammer 2 is concerned. But getting to his story, Luthor Harkon is a fascinating character. He is a very ancient being in the Warhammer world, and in fact originated from the lands of Nekakara. Now, for those of you who perhaps don't know the Warhammer world that well or are slightly new to my channel, Nekakara is this area of the Warhammer world. As you can see, it's almost directly south from the Empire. It's south of the Badlands. It's historically the land of an ancient empire known now as the Tomb Kings, but effectively they are the Warhammer world's version of the ancient Egyptians in our own world. So going back to the times of ancient Nekakara, the Tomb Kings gave rise to the first necromancer, the big bad of all undead in the Warhammer world, Nagash. And Nagash led a rebellion where he rose an army of the dead to go against the other lords of his home nation in order to rule over all of them. They managed to fight him back and defeat Nagash. But some people were enthralled by Nagash's ideas and where he got his power from and how he'd managed to extend his life. Amongst them was the princess of a region known as Lamia, here on the eastern coast of Nekakara itself. She took it upon herself to study the teachings of Nagash and learned to put together this elixir of life that she thought would grant her eternal life going forward. So she put this together with some help from some other characters who'd had their paths crossed with Nagash previously, and she came up with this elixir and drank it, but it was imperfect, and it in fact turned her into the first vampire. Knowing this sort of the new power that vampirism gave her, the speed, the strength, the extended life as long as she was able to consume human blood, she thought, okay, it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. So let's try and convert my most loyal subjects to this, and we'll start an entire empire run by us, an immortal leadership that will have a kingdom that lasts into eternity. So she sets about trying to consolidate her power in Lamia. She starts to turn some of the most powerful people in the area to vampires, so they will then go on to serve her. One of these characters she turned was a very well-known hero of the day, here on the left, known as Abarash. And Abarash is a legendary hero in ancient times, known as the best fighter the entire land of Nekakara had to offer. So she turned him against his will, but once he was in it, he kind of committed and himself started to turn some other people. One of those was Luthor of the tribe Harkoni. Now, Luthor at the time was the harbor master in Lamia, so he was running all the ships and running really all the goings-on of trade out of the port of Lamia. So as an important person in the town, he got converted to the cause and started to serve Abarash, and along with him, by connection, Neferata herself. Luthor also had a cousin known as Wallach, and he was also turned by Abarash, and Wallach is another character who comes up a lot in Vampire Count lore, as he is the current Grand Master of the Blood Dragons, the bloodline from which Blood Knights are formed. And this is a bloodline descendant from Abarash himself. Abarash has kind of disappeared from the world to a certain degree. You get reports of him here and there over the centuries, but Wallach's kind of the de facto guy in charge of that bloodline for now until Abarash's return to claim his rightful place. So that's his cousin, but Luthor so obviously has a very famous cousin, and they all stayed in Lamia trying to consolidate their power until they were eventually found out as a cult of vampires, and an army of the living marched against them and chased them out of Lamia. They kind of wandered around for a bit and eventually actually encountered Nagash and tried to join forces with him. Suffice it to say, it didn't really work out. I'm not going to get into the whole lengthy story about what exactly happened there. I'd recommend you maybe check out my Missing Legendary Lords Vampire Count video and start on the section that deals with Neferata for a little bit of a more in-depth view of the exact conflict that's happening in this ancient kingdom at the time between the vampires and being chased out of their homeland. Suffice to say, they were chased out eventually and settled a new city in the Badlands, which would become known as Morgheim. This kingdom, again, lasted for a good long time, but for vampires, of course, time isn't really an issue, but was eventually also overrun by Neferata's treachery to a certain degree and was just completely ransacked by a horde of greenskins. And that's when the vampires had to move even further north and ended up around the lands of Sylvania after a time. But Luthor Harkon was with the rest of his vampire kin up until around Morgheim. And with the fall of Morgheim, we kind of lose track of him for a few centuries. And then in the year of the imperial calendar, around 876, so around 1600 years before the start of the current Total War Warhammer timeline, a merchant vessel carrying a sarcophagus was making the trek across the open seas and was set upon by a bunch of Norscan raiders. They did, however, have the unfortunate luck of ransacking the merchant ship that was holding the sarcophagus of Luthor Harkon. No one's really sure what happened to it from the perspective of the Empire, but it's now known that much later, a Norscan ship was washed up upon the shores of Lustria in the area that would become known later on as the Vampire Coast. So Luthor Harkon, having survived the battle, had massacred anyone who'd fought against him and had presumably been forced to kill and feast upon all of the Norscans who had taken his sarcophagus from the merchant ship. So having been dashed upon the shores of this new world, Luthor Harkon was just surrounded by a bunch of dead bodies, and as vampires do, just thought, okay, I may as well raise these and start to have a look around. He started to consolidate a lot of his power in the area by collecting the corpses of dead monsters, of dead creatures, of anything else he could really resurrect to help serve his cause. And he began essentially a conquest of large proportions of this territory of Lustria with his horde of zombies. Now, it's not known why he decided to stick to zombies, but all of Luthor Harkon's forces and his pirates, as they would go up to be made up of, ended up being zombies. So they'd wander the forests of Lustria, encountering huge dinosaurs, and Luthor Harkon would use his magics to revive all the dead corpses he could, all the zombies of not only those initial merchants and Norscans who'd washed up on the shore with him, but also of any other merchants who'd been sort of stranded and whisked across the open ocean over the years. He would find their bodies, if not killing them himself, finding their bodies in the open ocean, resurrecting them, getting them to join his crew. And I think you'll agree, there's very much a kind of Pirates of the Caribbean vibe here. So Luthor Harkon starts to just explore the areas of Lustria, and eventually he starts to learn about the lizard men, learn about the old ones, learn about some of the ancient magics hidden in the temples and the benefits of ransacking the ruined cities to try and, firstly, for greed, for gold and monies, and secondly, for power and pride, and just to be able to find some magical things that will enhance his own abilities. So him and his zombie pirates began to ransack a lot of the ruins and whatever they could find of the Lizardmen Empire. They eventually came across Huatl here on the Vampire Coast itself. So this is presumably early doors in Luthor Harkon's conquest of the region. So once he got to Huatl, Luthor began to instruct his zombies to start digging up the old ruined city, see what they could find. And indeed, deep below one of the pyramids, they found a sealed chamber that had been undisturbed up to this point, completely unlooted, and Luthor Harkon started to get a bit excited. And he sent his zombies to go and force open the door, but whenever any of them got near, the witch fire in their eyes and the magic that animates them dissipated, and they would just simply collapse on the ground. And he couldn't get any of his zombies near the door, and so began to grow increasingly frustrated. The door was covered, obviously now, to Luthor's eyes, in magical seals that required a significant amount of magic to overcome. So, maybe succumbing to hubris slightly, he began to weave his own dark magics to try and force open the doors. However, these glyphs were built to keep out magic users far superior to the skills that Luthor Harkon possessed, and began to draw on his own magic and the energy of Luthor's magic and his life, and began to kill him. The glyphs were that powerful, that good against drawing away and nullifying magic. Luthor, in some kind of moment of inspiration or exasperation or just desperation, managed to, at the very last moment, sever the link. But his connection with magic was forever deteriorated, and the whole experience effectively shattered his mind and his psyche. He now had kind of disparate personalities that would argue and heckle amongst each other. He really was just said to be walking that line of insanity from that day forward. However, although he was now broken and not really, and kind of in some ways a shadow of his former self, it did not stop him, however, from continuing his conquest around the Vampire Coast, both on the oceans and on the land itself. He'd venture into the territories of the Lizardmen, and indeed provoked a reaction from the Lizardmen at some point when Lord Zeltep from the first city of Itza marched against him in the battle that would become known as the Battle of the Eclipse. Luthor Harkon was fought back at this point, but Luthor himself managed to escape, and the only thing that sustains the now vast fleet of zombie pirates that frequent this area was Luthor himself. So as long as Luthor survives, he can always look to reanimate bodies and find more corpses for his armies. He was defeated by this lord of the Lizardmen, but he did continue his conquest, and he began by setting up something known as the Siren Wall, or the Cyrene Wall, in perhaps the Warhammer language, but it gives you the right idea. He'd entrap lots of vessels passing to be sort of ensnared by sirens. They would crash, he'd get their corpses, and he proceeded to do this over the next few centuries, amassing a huge horde, all the while seeking revenge for this slight from this Lord Exultet. So with this in mind, he begins to build an enormous fleet. At that point, he doesn't stop there and immediately seek his revenge against the Lizardmen. He sends his undead pirates across the world. He raises ship wights, which are like the whites of the vampire counts, but ship captains, and they would go off and pillage around the world's oceans, and it began many rumors in the old world about these ghost ships that would just appear out of nowhere, kill entire crews, pillage and loot it, and then sail off with the ships themselves and all the bodies. And indeed, during this era, around the 1100s of the imperial calendar, so again, still well before the current Total War Warhammer timeline, he presided over a reign of terror across the high seas. At this point in history, around the year 1350, over the years of his conquest and bringing bodies and ravaging over the high seas, Luthor Harkon has amassed a huge force, and he's continuing to look to avenge himself upon the Lizardmen, steal many of their magic and ancient artifacts, as well as their riches, and finally to hopefully find a cure for his shattered mind. So he marches back in kind of the direction that the armies came for him the first time, but he gets it slightly wrong, or intentionally doesn't go to the same city, or perhaps didn't know initially where they came from, and he marched upon the city of Axolotl. And he, despite some fierce opposition from some skink rearguard, just annihilated it. It said a creeping mist of putrid festation was preceded this enormous, revolting zombie horde that just marched through the jungles of Lustria, and they set upon Axolotl, and it said that once they were done with it, despite a valiant last stand from the Lizardmen guarding the temple city, Luthor Harkon overran it, ransacked it, absolutely destroyed it. By the time the Lizardmen were able to return to the area, it said that not any two stones stood one upon the other. That's how devastating Luthor Harkon's destruction of this temple city was. Of course, Luthor retreated back to the coast in his stronghold and his fleets and his ships, slightly away from where the lizard men could really get to him, with, of course, a huge bounty of gold and magical items that he could use for his zombie hordes. And so still to this day, Luthor Harkon frequents the Vampire Coast looking for magical items. It's said at some point he teamed up with Marathi of the Dark Elves, and they too went sort of hunting for magical clues and things like that along the Lustrian coastline. But any explorers setting about the conquest of Lustria would do well to avoid the trappings and the siren calls of the Vampire Coast. In terms of Luthor Harkon on the tabletop, or as he prefers to be known, Luthor Harkon, the Arch Grand Commodore, he was given a set of rules that coincide with a lot of his backstory, but he was never really given a model himself. You always had to sort of convert it or make your own one, essentially. And I don't think Games Workshop ever officially set upon what he actually looks like. So there are some different drawings of him in different ways in different publications. So I don't think there's a set image of Luthor Harkon, but there are some cool interpretations of him around the internet. But there are some rules for him. So there is some flexibility there for Creative Assembly to make him a very cool looking character. Personally, I really love the image on the right, although one could argue that's maybe not a vampire, maybe is, maybe looks a bit too human, maybe he should look a bit more vampiric as the picture in the middle. I suppose it's open to interpretation. In terms of his rules and his weaponry, Luthor Harkon is a vampire, so again, a decent fighter, but he's been robbed of all his battle magic, essentially. He still has the ability to revive the dead, but he can't cast any battle spells. So he can revive his sort of zombie army, but he can't really do much else than that. He's armed with a hand weapon, and he's armed with a brace of pistol. It said he's not really allowed to take any additional items apart from that. Now, due to the effect of this warded vault that he encountered that robbed him of his ability to use magic properly and really almost killed him, it's had this lasting effect of having a kind of magical absorption around him. So he has a good amount of magic resistance, and he also on the tabletop would get extra dispel dice. So he'd essentially be able to stop your magic, although not really be able to cast any of his own. And this could be a really interesting rule in Total War Warhammer 2. There are dispel scrolls in Total War Warhammer 2, or 100% not dispels as such, but 100% miscast, where you can guarantee a miscast. But I always struggle to use them. They're not that handy. So maybe he'd just have an ability where the winds of magic would be very low in any battle you have with Luthor Harkon. I think that would be an appropriate translation of his rules from the tabletop. The elements of his split personality also come into play as well. At the beginning of every turn, or whenever he took a wound on the tabletop, you'd roll a 6-sided dice, and whatever the result was, he'd behave very differently. So on a 1 to a 3, Luthor Harkon would suffer the effects of stupidity. Now, we've spoken about stupidity before in some of the other models and army lists I've done in the past, but I don't think we'll see a direct translation of the stupidity rule, which would essentially prevent him really from moving or doing anything for a turn if he rolled that on the tabletop. But we're not going to see a translation of stupidity in Total War Warhammer. It's just too random, and there's not really a way that would work with a Total War game. So they might replace it with something like he gets negative melee defense or negative melee attack or something like that. But it'd be very interesting if every turn you had a different sort of maybe one single stat that switched out on Luthor Harkon, and before you got him into battle, you'd probably want to check that stat that would pop up. That would be quite an interesting way of doing it in terms of the campaign turns. He just gets a different ability every one, or maybe just make it a little bit less than that, every 5 or every 10. Just make it rotate a little bit. I think that would do the tabletop rules justice. If he rolled a 4 on the dice at the start of the turn, he'd be mad, which would give him the ability Frenzy. And if he rolled a 5, he'd essentially be normal. You could do whatever you wanted with him. Bad's kind of what's regarded as Luthor Harkon's default personality, which is maybe saying something. And on a 6, he'd get Hatred, which would give him a better chance to hit. And there is Hatred in Total War Warhammer already, so they might just use that as a translation, or just maybe give him higher melee attack. So that's kind of the unique rules to Luthor Harkon. Very interesting character. And he actually has an army, essentially, behind him. There are special rules for the zombie pirates written up, not in any army book, but in the White Dwarf magazine, which was a monthly magazine that Games Workshop, the creators of Warhammer, used to publish. And they've given the zombie pirate stats before, but they've actually gone into a bit more detail, if you're not familiar with it, into some of the different units that Luthor Harkon can have, making them possibly a very interesting sub-faction in their own right. Now, whether Creative Assembly will reinforce all of these, we don't know, but let's go through some of the special units that Luthor Harkon's army ideally has access to. And let's start with the heroes in that army. So the heroes of the zombie pirates are the fleet captains. And as I mentioned, these are effectively wights from the vampire count. And so skeleton warriors, specially chosen by Luthor Harkon himself. As such, there is a propensity for the fleet captains to be slightly unhinged raised spirits who do like a bit of bloodletting and murder, as any good pirate should, really, if you ask me. But there's also a couple of special rules that these heroes and a number of the units that Luthor Harkon's army gets that no other undead army really gets. The first is that they're aquatic. It's a rule that the lizard men have a lot, and it's the idea that they don't suffer penalties through marshland or through swampland or anything like that. And in fact, on the tabletop, they'd get soft cover from that kind of thing. I've speculated before in my lizard men army video that aquatic might translate as giving units with aquatic the ability stalk in Total War Warhammer. So rather than give them cover, if you hide out units in a swamp, they'd actually be able to stay hidden. So these guys could maybe like submerge their bodies. And the idea is that the corpses that Luthor Harkon revives tend to be like found in water or have a close tie to water and are thus have this ability aquatic. It's a little bit loose, but I'm willing to let it go because it's still a lot of fun to have these guys in the army. Now, Luthor Harkon's raising magic, his necromancy in essence, is a little bit different from any other necromancers, and in the way that he's managed to weave a particular enchantment into his necromancy that allows his zombies to do complex actions. So they can actually use black powder weaponry, which is something that none of the other undead factions can do. So they can use pistols, and they can use cannons. Now, they might not be the best shots with either of these two options, but they can use them. And indeed, the fleet captains themselves have the option of being armed with a hand weapon, so a sword or an axe or what have you, and a pistol. So these guys can fire off pistols and be kind of a skirmishing lord, with probably limited aim, I would say. Not dissimilar to the witch hunters we have in Total War Warhammer 1. But the fleet captains also have another special ability. They have an ability whereby all of their weapons do magical damage, and they have Killing Blow. Now, we've seen the wights and the vampire counts have Killing Blow. They'll have very similar stats to that if they're ever introduced into Total War Warhammer 2. And for me, it's a bit of a flight of fancy that we'll ever see this unit or the rest of Luthor Harkon's army. We might see Luthor Harkon himself, but this is a bit of a flight of fancy, but I thought you guys might enjoy going through the army list. So those are the fleet captains, one of his hero units. The others are the Sirens, or the Sirens. Now, these guys are very similar to Banshees, and I think you could really just use the Banshee model. Sirens, long in our own mythology, we've had them. I'm not sure if you actually pronounce it differently in the Warhammer one. It is spelt a Siren, so it is spelled slightly differently, but the idea is still the same. They lure passing by ships into reefs that crash and kill all the sailors inside. Now, you could give them fishtails and have them float about like the Spellweavers, or you could just make them Banshees for the sake of it, and just have them on there. In terms of their tabletop rules, they are ethereal, and they do have an ability called Siren's Call. Now, on the tabletop, this is a shooting attack that if you hit with it, cast the spell Doom and Darkness on a unit. I think in Total War Warhammer, it would be essentially a bound spell to the unit, where they can cast Doom and Darkness on any enemies around them, but they'd act as Banshees, essentially, much like Banshees do for the vampire counts at the moment. But you could play around with the idea of the fishtail, although I think in the original Greek mythology, sirens were just women on rocks rather than mermaids on rocks. I think that's maybe new. Let me know if you know that for certain, one way or the other, guys. But that is the other hero unit for Luthor Harkon's zombie pirates. And as you guys know, they set up the Sirens well, and Luthor Harkon is known to either enslave or just use the Banshees which are ethereal, and so one has to presume dead, much like the Banshees, to lure sailors to their deaths with their mystifying calls and alluring songs. Moving on to the infantry units in Luthor Harkon's army. First up, we have the zombie pirate deckhand mob. Just your typical zombie pirates. These ones don't have any pistols, just hand weapons. They're just zombies. They could look cool with little hats and with pirate symbols on them. But zombies, I mean, there's not much else to say. You guys get the idea. We've had zombies in Total War Warhammer before. It'd be great to see special pirate skins on them. Maybe the modders might actually get to this before Creative Assembly does. Let's have our fingers crossed either way. We see these guys quite soon after the release of the second game. But that's the zombie pirate deckhand mob. The next unit is the zombie pirate gunnery mob. So these guys are the I don't want to go as far as to say pistoliers because they're not mounted or anything, but essentially much like the militia in the Empire army, they have a hand weapon, they have a pistol, they can do a bit of both, but they're zombies, so they still have terrible aim, and they're slow, and they're still zombies. So that's Luthor Harkon's pirate gunnery mob, but there is a missile unit available to Luthor Harkon. Now, the thing that we'd have to note with any Total War Warhammer army, with Luthor Harkon's army list, is that all of his units are effectively zombies. Zombies of some kind or another. And thus, his unit size in his armies would be huge. You'd have to have probably quite a powerful PC to do it any real justice. But the idea is there's just massive numbers of these guys. So that's the zombie pirate gunnery mob. Not particularly accurate, not particularly great in combat, but there you go. And one little thing on this model that I love, because as with all of these were never officially released. These are all conversions that Games Workshop decided to showcase. So you can never go and buy this in a shop. You'd have to make it yourself. And one lovely touch I love on this modeling is if you look at the banner for the pirate mob, it looks like there's a little halfling or something, zombie halfling, just at the top of the banner firing off things with his slingshot. And I think that is a brilliant little touch. But that is the zombie pirate gunnery mob. Next up, we have the bloated corpses. Now, this is the idea that Luthor Harkon has revived bodies of those who have been in the ocean or in a swamp for such an extended period of time that their bodies have become just bloated, festooning gas bubbles, walking gas bubbles of poison and decay. And these guys are single units, so they don't go around in sort of multiple. It's just like one unit, and they charge into combat. They do poison damage when they're in combat because their flesh is kind of half liquefied and flying off at you, and just they stink, and it's just all very, very disgusting. And when you actually kill one, they do something called gaseous demise, which is they set off a little explosion, and that does armor-piercing damage to anyone within the area of effect. So these guys would charge in and just be a little kamikaze unit, not unlike the Fanatics, but they're not hidden in any other units. They just kind of charge around the battlefield. So you want to hit them from distance. You want to use your archers and stuff like that, because if they get in close and you kill one, they explode, and that's maybe a quarter of your unit gone, I think, if you ever put them into Total War Warhammer 2. So that's a cool little idea for a unique take on making an only zombie army fairly interesting. Next up, we have the animated Hulks. Now, creatures of human size or human stature aren't the only things that wander around the seas, and they're not the only things that Luthor Harkon can revive. He can bring back dead things that are much larger as well, like ogres. And ogres get around the Warhammer world a fair bit, and a lot of them work as mercenaries and take to the seas as well. And those are revived to make up his ranks of animated Hulks. Now, these guys have an okay stat line for zombie units, effectively, and can do a good amount of damage. But that's the idea behind the animated Hulks. One could imagine it'd be ogres or maybe reanimated trolls or whatever have you, but the animated Hulks, huge lumbering zombies that do all kinds of damage and can just be absolutely devastating on a battlefield. Next, we are moving into the artillery area, and of course, with a zombie army, that might seem unusual, but as I said, these zombies can use black powder. So the first unit we're looking at are the deck gunners. And the deck gunners, essentially the idea that zombies have taken the deck gun. So if you know about pirating or pirate ships, there's kind of swivel deck guns on a lot of ships that you could point back at the deck if you were being boarded, or point at the opposing ship's deck and just fire it at them. But essentially very small cannon that could be relatively devastating. Again, these are crewed by 2 guys. They can act as a unit, so you can have multiple of these in any unit. So maybe in Total War Warhammer 2, we'd see 4 or 5 of them if they're ever introduced in a single unit. And they can do some half-decent damage. Again, aim not the best in the world, not the best equipment. A lot of it is just rusted and corroded and been left in the ocean for far too long. But the zombies seem to get it to work from time to time, and so can be effective. So those are the deck gunners. The next piece of artillery we have is the carronade. Now, the carronade is essentially the idea that zombies have taken a cannon from their ships, which they can use and fire cannon from, and have just used it for their land battles. So it works very much like any other cannon in Total War Warhammer, maybe a little bit worse aim, and a little bit maybe shorter range as well, because I think they've been messed around with a bit. They're not as efficient, one could argue. So that is the carronade. So access to cannons, which is very interesting for a vampire count army, effectively. Or kind of a bastardized zombie army more than a vampire count army. Next up, we have a unique unit in Luthor Harkon's army, his pride and joy, Queen Bess. Now, the idea of Queen Bess is it's just an enormous cannon. I couldn't really find any fantastic conversions of this one, but the Empire ships have a ship known as the Hellhammer. I covered that when I covered my naval combat in Total War Warhammer 2, when I thought that might still be a thing, but I went through all the units of the naval combat in Warhammer, and I made a quick video of that. If you're interested in checking that out, check the top right-hand corner or the description. But the Empire have these ships that essentially house cannons that are so large they take up almost the entirety of a ship. And it's thought that Luthor Harkon's managed to get his hands on one of these, make some improvements to it, shorten the cannon a little bit, but it's still an enormous piece of equipment that can be absolutely devastating. And on the tabletop, it had some fairly interesting and unique rules in the way it fired. So Queen Bess would fire off a huge cannonball, and you'd say where you wanted it to hit on the tabletop. You'd roll the scatter dice, so that's just the idea of the randomness of it. But what the Queen Bess would do is it could continue bouncing along, and every time it hit the ground, it would effectively cause such a huge amount of concussive force that it would act as an explosion. So you just have this enormous cannonball kind of slamming against the ground as it went along, and it could hit the ground multiple times and causing an explosion every time it hit the ground. So if you got your angles right, it could be potentially devastating to an enemy army, because it would just bounce through 4 or 5 different units, causing not only just a cannon shot to go through them, but an actual explosion to hit each unit. And that was the Queen Bess. So a fascinating little cannon there, and as I said, Luthor Harkon's pride and joy. Moving on to the monsters and beasts of Luthor Harkon's navy, we have the scurvy dogs. Now, the idea of these is just that they were dogs to the captains of their ships and to merchants and things like that, and they just followed. The dogs themselves weren't killed, apparently, but they just followed their masters, and I'm not sure, it's maybe hinted that the dogs have died or not. I'm not 100% sure on that in the way they're described, but I got the idea that the dogs are still alive, but they're so loyal they follow around their dead masters anyway, and so have become quite effective war dogs. So they can be scurvy dogs, or there's an upgraded model just known as bad dogs, and I thought that was a hilarious name for a unit of war dogs, just bad dogs. Bad dogs. And they charge into battle, much like the hounds and the wolves we've seen in Total War Warhammer already. They're quick, they can get around the battlefield, great for munching down on any enemy missile units, and yeah, a good helpful unit to give you some speed in an otherwise relatively very slow army. After them, we have the Razortooth Rats. Now, the models I've shown here are just the normal Skaven Giant Rat models. And I suppose you could, if we're getting Skaven in the Total War Warhammer 2, you could just convert them across the Giant Rat models, and they'd make the same thing. The idea is these rats are on the ship, they become a bit picky, and they don't really like eating dead flesh, so they go along on Luthor Harkon's ships, and as soon as they dock somewhere or come into a port they want to raid, all of these rats scurry off in a devouring hunger, because they've just been starved for so long for living flesh, and they just go and attack anything that's walking, along with the hordes of zombies of Luthor Harkon. So those are the Razortooth Rats. And next up, we have one of my favorite units in Luthor Harkon's army, the Deck Droppers. And the idea is that a lot of Fellbats tend to roost on the masts and the spars of Luthor Harkon's ships. And when they come into conflict, these bats, unlike other Fellbats, decide to do an interesting thing, and that is pick up a zombie and fly that zombie into battle with them. Now, they're described as just having a hand weapon, these zombies, but this model inspired me, and it would be great to have maybe a melee version of these Deck Droppers and a missile version of these Deck Droppers, where the zombies, at this point, very disorientated and confused, can try and fire their pistols at any units on the ground being carted around by these enormous Fellbats. I just think that would be, it's just so fascinating, such a funny little thing to do. And you could even give them the option of maybe trying to drop like kegs of black powder or something as a bombing attack. There's a lot of flexibility you could have with the idea of these Deck Droppers that I think could be potentially hilarious in any Total War Warhammer 2 game. And last, but by no means least, we have the idea of the Rotting Leviathan. Now, the Rotting Leviathan is the idea that in the Warhammer world, as I'd covered in the naval video I mentioned earlier, there are a number of sea monsters that permeate the seas of the Warhammer world. Now, a lot of these can't really, even propelled by dark magics, wouldn't really be great at sort of moving around on land. But Luthor Harkon likes to have these animals die or find the corpse of one of them and then turn them undead and turn them into one of his servants. Now, of the ones that could probably get around on land, you're probably looking at the Gargantuan, this kind of huge sea snake. You're looking at the Sea Dragon, and you're looking at the Promethean. Now, the idea of the Rotting Leviathan is a little bit misleading because there is a monster in the Warhammer world known as the Leviathan, but I checked, and it's not referring specifically to an undead Leviathan, because that's essentially a fish and couldn't really transport itself around on land, even if it was propelled by magic. So it's really just the idea that these are huge sea creatures that have been brought back to life by Luthor Harkon to serve him. As I said, my personal favorite is the Promethean. I love the idea of just this enormous rotting crab like marching along with your huge zombie horde with cannon going off behind you towards your enemies. Just a terrifying sight. And of course, these things cause terror as well. Also, they'd have an additional rule, particularly I think if you you'd have to pick one of these monsters to make it. It seems these are conversions of the crab idea and the sea dragon idea, but I'd like the idea of the crab because I think that makes probably the most sense about getting around on land. Plus, it could give you the excuse to have a really heavily armored monster unit going around with Luthor Harkon's army, just the idea of the massive crab shell. They also have another special rule known as Slimy Skin, which would effectively give anyone trying to attack it -1 chance to hit on the tabletop. That in Total War Warhammer translates as less melee attack. So they could have a little debuff zone around them for melee attack. Just the idea that there's this putrid slime of decay and rot all over them. And so it makes it hard to land a solid hit. But that is the Rotting Leviathan, and that really kind of sums up the rest of Luthor Harkon's army list. I hope you guys enjoyed that. It's a bit of a flight of fancy. I think we will maybe see Luthor Harkon himself represented in some way, shape, or form in Total War Warhammer 2. As for his army list, I think it's hilarious and would be amazing to see, but I doubt we'll see it put together. Maybe as part of a DLC once the third game's out as an afterthought of the whole trilogy. But they've got a lot of the main stuff to put through before we start seeing fun little stuff like this. And it's been, in a way, kind of ushered off to the side of the Warhammer universe. But it's a great army. I love the idea of those deck droppers. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. As I said, thank you very much to my patrons, John, Reese, Colin, Thomas, Mateus, and Samuel. And thank you guys for backing me on that and for voting to have Luthor Harkon be the topic of this video. And yeah, if you want to get on the next one, do check out my Patreon page, guys. But as always, thank you to everyone for watching this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this one as much as I enjoyed making it. And I look forward to catching you on the next one.